Hi, this is Mr. Gideon. So we've talked about the Keynesian view on monetary policy, but actually the classical theorists predate. They came along before Keynesian theory, and so we need to spend a little bit of time on that. And there's a real detailed background to how classical theorists interpret monetary policy and their views, primarily because their tradition is to focus on the money supply. So first of all, with regards to the money supply and the price level, classical economists believe that changes in the money supply affect the price level. Their position was based on the equation of exchange and the simple quantity theory of money. So what's the equation of exchange? The equation of exchange says that M times V must equal P times Q. M stands for the money supply, V is the velocity of money, or the average number of times a dollar in our country, for instance, because that's our currency, is spent to buy final goods and services in a year. This is an average, of course. Not all money is used as frequently as other money. It's kind of silly to reference, but once in a while in class I might like to show an episode of SpongeBob that my children like called Money Talks, where Mr. Krabs, who I think most of us know is a real miser and doesn't like to spend his money. He likes to acquire, but he doesn't like to spend it, is in a little bit of trouble because once he fantasizes about being able to talk to his money actually gets this magical quality, and it talks back to him saying, "Dude, I'm not very happy. You lock me up in your house, and I never get out to have any fun. You don't spend me." We're not like the other dollars floating around out there that have a reasonable amount of velocity. They get to change hands and go from place to place as people spend those dollars. So, of course, when we're talking about velocity, we're talking about a rough average, but of course some money travels faster or more frequently than other money. P is the price level, and Q is the real output or GDP in this economy. So another thing you want to understand that follows from the equation of exchange is that you can rearrange the equation of exchange to look at certain variables like velocity. Velocity, of course, would be equal to GDP divided by the money supply. But the important thing about the equation of exchange is what it really means. It means, first of all, the money supply multiplied by velocity must equal the price level times real GDP, and that the money supply multiplied by velocity must equal nominal GDP. That's another way to kind of rearrange the right side of the equation. But this is really the key piece. That total spending, M times V is total spending. Think about this. The money supply times how frequently it travels because it's getting spent must equal all the money that's getting made. All the stuff that's being bought, all right, is being bought for money. And the left side can be thought of the people, the spenders, giving that money to other people, and the right side can be thought of the people making that money, the people that are receiving it in exchange for goods and services. So to move in the classical tradition from the equation of exchange to the simple quantity theory of money is only one step. And the simple quantity theory of money says that, well, in the short term, I think it's safe to assume that velocity and real output are constant. They don't change much in the short run. And therefore, you can predict any change in the money supply will bring about a change in the price level. In this theory, they actually say that it'll be a strictly proportional change. So that if, let's say, these two constants are in place, the velocity and the output, they're not going to be changing in the short run, then a short run change of 10% to the money supply, would lead to a 10% change in the price level. Or let's say you increase the money supply by 10%, it's going to increase prices by 10%. This is a really key piece. And if you follow the equation of exchange up until this point, then you might start to go, yeah, I mean, that's just kind of basic math, I guess. I mean, it's theory, but it's also math. And I can see why classical theorists would say, look, government, stay out of things, because all you're going to do is make prices higher, and you're not going to effectively change the economy. And this is a hypothetical example of what we're talking about. Let's say that the velocity is 4. On average, a dollar is spent or used 4 times in a year. And let's say in the short run, this is output in whatever units you want to use. Then the money supply is at 500 and prices are at 2. And then there's this kind of an increase, a 100% increase, then it would lead to a 100% increase in the price level. 50% would lead to 50% increase in the price level. And even a decrease in the money supply of 20%, according to this theory, should lead to a 20% decrease in the price level. This classical model of the price level is much more likely to be a good approximation of reality in economies experiencing persistently high inflation, like in the case of Zimbabwe. These are figures related to Zimbabwe, the African country that really has been famous for years now for, in part, having to struggle with exorbitant amounts of inflation. And these numbers are correct as you're looking at this. I mean, this is 1,000% inflation, 10,000% inflation. Severe pain, as you can imagine, for those citizens living in Zimbabwe. As a matter of fact, a student recently gave me some of the now discontinued currency from this time period, and I believe the one sheet of paper that he gave me was marked $100 trillion. So that's how worthless the currency became before it was discontinued. But you can see that the money supply and the consumer price index for that country, as they're plotted over this period of time, really almost mirror each other very, very closely. And so this seems to give some evidence, some credence to the classical theory about money supply and prices. You might ask yourself, well, why? Especially this statement of why does it seem to be even more true in countries that are experiencing persistently high inflation, like Zimbabwe? Well, it's because, as you can imagine, you get to this mindset where you just expect, to continue in the future what's happened to you in the past. You can think a little bit back to adaptive expectations, actually, and how, that segment of classical theory was talking about that's how, most, if not all, people form their expectations about the future. So, in the case of inflation, let's say you're living in Zimbabwe, you get so used to the inflation that you kind of make preparations for it. If you're an employer or if you're a laborer, you expect inflation to be out of control and for it to not change anytime soon, and so you adapt to that life, that reality, and you're quick to raise your wages and prices in response to changes in the money supply. Now, if we take it a step further, this simple quantity theory within the aggregate supply and demand framework, there are some things that you want to understand, among which have to do with the aggregate demand curve, the aggregate supply curve, and how they come together. But if you see a visual of this, it could look like this, where in this hypothetical example, we could start at AD1 here, with a money supply of $800 billion and a velocity of 2. And if we increase the money supply by 20 billion, then we would have AD shift to the right. But because this doesn't change in the short run, all it does is lead to higher prices. The same is also true in reverse according to the theory. If we go from a money supply of 800 billion down to 780 billion, and because, according to classical theory, the quantity of real output doesn't change in the short run, then all we're going to have is lower prices. And if we drop the assumption that V and Q are constant, we get a more general theory of price level determination. The bottom line with this is that changes in the price level depend on the money supply, velocity, and real GDP. But the money supply plays a really, really important role. Classical theorists believe that although it can change aggregate demand, as you just saw in the hypothetical visual above, and it can change it in the short run, money is neutral in the long term, and it has no real effects on the economy other than the area of price level. So short run, sure, it can shift AD. Long run, It's not even going to do that much. It's known as monetary neutrality. So here's an example of monetary neutrality in theory. All right, so we're kind of taking it a step further than the visual further up on this page. AD shifts to the right, but especially if we happen to get to some kind of a gap, like an inflationary gap, there are going to be changes where if wages and prices are flexible, SORAS is going to shift back to the left, the economy is going to fix itself, and even that change is not going to last. What we mean by not lasting is not that AD never shifted in the first place, but that that effect is not going to hold. The most important of which being that the unemployment rate is going to be lower, or that incomes are going to be higher, and so forth. We're just going to get back to where our starting point was with all of those things, but along this axis, prices are going to be higher. And as you notice with SORAS shifting left, one reason is shown below, that as the increase in the money supply lowers the interest rate in the short run, in the long run, we're going to get back to where we were with interest rates, because as prices go up in the economy, people are going to need more money to afford higher prices. And so they go back into this market in step 3 after the interest rate, the equilibrium interest rate, has swung down here, and they increase their demand for money to afford whatever it is that they need. And when that curve shifts, we get back to roughly the same interest rate that we had in the beginning of all of this. In this illustration up above, selected countries are shown during the last 35 to 40 years, different parts of the globe, and they have, of course, as you can see here, plotted the average annual interest rate and the price level against the average annual increase in the money supply to see if there's a correlation. And this scatter plot seems to lie pretty close to the 45-degree line, showing a more or less proportional relationship between the money and price level. And this would seem to support the whole concept of monetary neutrality.